If you allowed your eyes to linger just a fraction too long on the meticulously uniform exterior of my home, you could practically feel the quiet, desperate erosion of your own individuality, swallowed whole by a shade of vinyl siding the developers had optimistically branded Tuscan sand, though anyone with a pulse and a working set of retinas would simply call it the color of surrendered dreams. It was the exact same lifeless hue as the flawlessly edged sidewalks, the identical tone of the uniform mailbox posts, and the precise, stifling emotional baseline of every single soul residing within the manicured, iron-gated borders of Cypress Point, a sprawling suburban labyrinth nestled deep in the humid, suffocating embrace of Charleston, South Carolina. I was standing on my front steps, a mug of rapidly warming dark roast clamped in my hand, feeling the oppressive midsummer southern heat wrapping around my throat like a damp towel, though the sweat prickling at my hairline had absolutely nothing to do with the temperature and everything to do with the pulsing, aggressive little red laser, currently performing a chaotic, jerky dance across the wood of my porch pillar. I tracked the invisible beam's trajectory, my eyes tracing a path from the newly installed metal bracket holding my modest, hardware store-bought American flag, down across the chemically green, relentlessly weeded expanse of my front lawn, past the razor-sharp curb, landing squarely on the sensible, orthopedically supportive footwear of Margaret, the undisputed, iron-fisted chairwoman of the Cypress Point Architectural Control Committee. Margaret was a woman who approached neighborhood governance with the grim, unblinking intensity of a military tactician, once famously using a spirit level to verify the horizontal integrity of a neighbor's birdbath, currently armored against the brutal 90-degree morning in a starched linen blouse and khaki trousers that seemed chemically engineered to repel both moisture and human joy. She stood there, clutching a digital laser measure in one rigidly tense hand and a heavy, clip-bound ledger in the other, calculating the exact geometry of my alleged disobedience while I tried to suppress the rising, irrational urge to install an electrified mode, offering a forced, neighborly greeting that she didn't even pretend to acknowledge. Instead, she merely tightened her jaw, her eyes glinting like shattered glass behind her frameless spectacles, as she muttered the exact distance from the primary structural support to the municipal pavement to no one in particular, her pen slashing aggressively across a triplicate form as she marched up my driveway with that terrifying, rhythmic heel strike that every resident in a 3-block radius knew instinctively meant financial ruin. She stopped precisely at the property line, wielding a terrifyingly encyclopedic knowledge of the neighborhood's 200-page covenant, reciting subsection, paragraph, and clause regarding the strict prohibition of unauthorized, non-earth-toned textile displays, her nasal voice slicing through the thick morning air as she declared my standard, 3x5 holiday flag an aggressive, visually abrasive disruption to the community's carefully curated, monotonous aesthetic harmony. I tried to inject some sanity into the suffocating interaction, laughing a hollow, echoing laugh, reminding her that it was the week of the 4th of July, that we lived in the United States, that the very soil beneath her sensible shoes was steeped in a history of rebellion that surely didn't prioritize the sanctity of beige over patriotism. But trying to reason with Margaret was like trying to negotiate with a particularly stubborn glacier. She informed me, with a terrifying, venomous calm, that the bold crimson and navy fabrics were hostile colors that assaulted the visual integrity of the street, casually adding that the 2 small screws I had driven into the pillar constituted an illegal structural modification, casually slapping a violently pink $50 citation against my chest that promised to double every single day the textile menace remained airborne, before pivoting on her heel and marching off to terrorize the Abernethys over the placement of their recycling bin. I didn't take it down immediately, retreating instead into the cool, air-conditioned sanctuary of my kitchen where my wife, Elena, a woman whose immense capacity for logic was the only thing keeping us tethered to this sterile neighborhood, took one look at the citation and sighed the heavy, tired sigh of someone who knew exactly how much a war of attrition with the HOA would cost our carefully guarded vacation fund. We had been meticulously scraping together every spare dollar for a trip to Aruba, a desperate, sun-soaked escape from the crushing weight of our mortgages and the endless, gray corporate grind, and she gently but firmly begged me to just swallow my pride, take down the flag, and pay the ransom rather than feed the fines until they devoured our plane tickets. I stubbornly fought back, spending hours drafting a passionate, legally hollow appeal referencing federal flag protection acts, hitting submit on the outdated community portal with the arrogant, misguided confidence of a man who thought common sense still had a place in suburban governance, only to be utterly crushed 48 hours later by an automated rejection email that masterfully weaponized legal jargon, arguing that while the government allowed flags, the HOA maintained the legal right to enforce reasonable restrictions regarding size, placement, and color intensity, slapping me with a newly doubled fine that made my stomach twist into cold, hard knots. It was the realization that she possessed infinite time, an endless supply of triplicate forms, and the full, terrifying backing of contract law, a realization that drove me out into the fading, golden light of the evening with a screwdriver in my hand, unscrewing the bracket while Margaret watched from her driveway across the street, offering me a single, deeply humiliating nod of victory that stripped away the last remnants of my dignity. I sat in my fenced-in backyard that night, drinking cheap domestic beer, staring up at the aging, slate-gray shingles of my roof that the inspector had warned us would need replacing in the next few years, letting the humiliation curdle into a cold, hyper-focused rage as I opened the massive PDF of the community bylaws on my phone, desperately scrolling through page after page of soul-crushing restrictions on door colors, shutter trims, and lawn ornaments, searching for a single crack in the armor. And then, at the bottom of the 8th section, buried beneath strict mandates regarding the prohibition of metal roofing and the requirement for high-quality asphalt materials, I found a glaring, magnificent, beautiful void. A loophole created by the sheer lack of imagination of the original developers who, 2 decades ago when asphalt only came in 3 depressing shades, had meticulously mandated the material and the maintenance of the roof, but had fundamentally, catastrophically failed to specify a restricted color palette. I practically sprinted inside, the plastic lawn chair violently scraping across the concrete patio, dragging a bewildered Elena to the glowing screen, my voice shaking with a manic, terrifying energy as I explained that modern roofing technology had evolved, that commercial suppliers could now bake UV-resistant, brilliant, unyielding colors directly into impact-rated architectural asphalt, and that because a roof was a permanent, structural necessity and not a temporary decorative flag, I was about to turn the entire 2,000-square-foot front slope of our house into an indestructible, legally compliant monument to the very colors Margaret had banished. Elena stared at me, the horror of spending $15,000, our entire Aruba fund, and our emergency savings combined, battling her own deep-seated, simmering resentment for the neighborhood dictator, until a slow, dangerous, beautiful smile finally crept across her face, her only condition being that if we were going to blow our life savings on a chaotic act of structural vengeance, it had to be an absolute, flawless masterpiece. Finding a contractor willing to risk the wrath of a neighborhood known for weaponizing code enforcement was a near impossible task, leading me away from the polished, heavily branded corporate roofing fleets and into the shadowy, cash-only depths of online classifieds, where I found Hutch, a towering, heavily bearded renegade of the construction world whose rusted, diesel-belching flatbed truck sounded like an active artillery engagement when it finally rattled onto our pristine, aggressively quiet street. Hutch stepped out, his steel-toed boots hitting the immaculate pavement, his eyes immediately locking onto the twitching curtains of Margaret's front window, listening to my completely unhinged, wildly expensive proposal to hand-cut custom-dyed polymer shingles into a massive, structurally sound mosaic of the American flag, his initial reluctance melting into a wide, dangerous grin the moment he read the glaring omission in the community's architectural bylaws, fully understanding that we were about to weaponize malicious compliance to strike a blow against bureaucratic tyranny. To pull off a logistical miracle of this magnitude without triggering a preemptive legal strike, Hutch sourced the blindingly vibrant materials from a specialized commercial branding supplier in Georgia, having them delivered on massive pallets tightly bound in opaque, unmarked black shrink wrap by a fiercely indifferent freight driver named Gus, who swatted away Margaret's frantic, clipboard-waving interrogations about unauthorized construction staging with a careless shrug, leaving her furious and completely blind to the bomb sitting in my driveway. The invasion began on a blistering Thursday morning when Hutch arrived with his fiercely loyal, heavily tattooed crew. A hulking giant named Goliath, a perpetually restless chainsmoker named Twitch, and a quiet, intensely focused younger guy named Mateo, hauling massive sections of steel scaffolding that they rapidly erected along the entire front facade of my house, immediately cloaking the whole operation behind giant, opaque blue containment tarps. When Margaret inevitably marched across the street at dawn, screaming up at the billowing plastic that it violated the strictly enforced neutral-tone construction protocols, Hutch poked his head through a seam, effortlessly weaving a terrifying, OSHA-compliant lie about discovering highly volatile, deeply aggressive toxic black mold beneath the old flashing, a fabricated environmental crisis so horrifying to her sterile sensibilities that she physically recoiled, covering her mouth and practically sprinting back to the safety of her home after verifying the generic, non-specific county roofing permit taped to my glass door. Beneath that suffocating blue canopy, surrounded by the brutal heat and the choking smell of industrial adhesive, an absolute marvel of illicit engineering was taking shape. I climbed up the scaffolding on Friday evening, my breath catching in my throat as I stared down at the half-completed masterpiece, marveling at how Mateo had meticulously hand-cut the blinding, titanium-white stars, inlaying them seamlessly into a field of custom-glazed, midnight blue asphalt, while Goliath precisely aligned the screaming, fire-engine red stripes with the complex valleys of the roofline, sealing the entire structure with a clear-coat UV glaze that caught the fading light and practically burned it back into the sky. When Saturday morning broke, the neighborhood was cloaked in the heavy, quiet lethargy of the weekend, the crew moving with a hushed, reverent urgency as they hammered in the final ridge caps, waiting for the exact moment when Margaret would emerge for her daily perimeter patrol, her beige track suit blending perfectly into the drab surroundings as she inevitably stopped in front of my property, demanding the immediate removal of the blue tarps. On Hutch's booming command, the crew slashed the heavy-duty zip ties, gravity tearing the massive blue sheets down to the manicured lawn in a dramatic, theatrical reveal, allowing the rising southern sun to strike the 2,000-square-foot canvas of gloss-coated asphalt, detonating a visual explosion of absolute, unadulterated color that seemed to violently tear a hole in the muted, soul-crushing fabric of Cypress Point. Margaret froze, the clipboard slipping from her numb fingers and shattering on the concrete, her mouth working uselessly as she staggered backward from the sheer, blinding magnitude of the display, finally finding her voice in a breathless, high-pitched shriek of pure outrage, fumbling for her cell phone to call the authorities, hysterically reporting a catastrophic act of architectural vandalism and domestic terror, completely unaware that she had just invited the law to witness her ultimate defeat. Within minutes, the piercing wail of sirens shattered the suburban peace, two county sheriff cruisers aggressively locking down the street, doors flying open as Sergeant Vance, a seasoned veteran with the exhausted posture of a man deeply tired of neighborly squabbles, and his eager, wide-eyed rookie, Officer Reed, practically leapt from the vehicles with their hands resting near their duty belts, anticipating a violent riot, only to follow the trembling, hysterical pointing of Margaret's finger upward, stopping dead in their tracks as they took off their aviators to stare at the glowing, magnificent roof. While Margaret screamed about visual hate crimes, plummeting property values, and aggressive color theory, demanding my immediate arrest and the forcible dismantling of the structure, Sergeant Vance slowly turned to me, his face an absolute masterclass in professional stoicism, fighting back a tiny, dangerous smirk as he legally clarified that reflecting sunlight was a matter of physics, not vandalism, and that expressing patriotism through legally permitted, code-compliant asphalt materials was fundamentally protected, loudly threatening to cite a hyperventilating Margaret for the malicious misuse of emergency services if she ever dialed 911 over a color dispute again, leaving her standing alone on the sidewalk, shaking with a cold, apocalyptic fury, plotting a vengeance that would soon threaten to take everything I owned. The euphoria of victory, fueled by the quiet cheers of oppressed neighbors and the viral photograph snapped by Officer Reed, was violently extinguished just hours later when a specialized courier arrived at my door, silently handing over a massive, incredibly dense legal dossier from Blackwell, Sterling and Pierce, the ruthless corporate law firm retained by the HOA, containing a devastating notice of intent to foreclose. They had convened a secret, emergency executive session while I was celebrating, utilizing a vague, heavily weaponized nuisance clause to legally bypass the missing color restriction, determining that because my roof was composed of thousands of individual asphalt tabs, each brightly colored shingle constituted a separate, distinct violation of community harmony, assessing an utterly ruinous fine of 10 cents per shingle per day, a mathematical nightmare that instantly buried us under thousands of dollars in debt and started a 14-day countdown before they seized our home. Panic, thick and suffocating, gripped my chest as Elena frantically calculated how fast we could liquidate our retirement accounts just to stall the legal machine, forcing me into a desperate, midnight internet dive where I uncovered a legendary, aggressively uncompromising First Amendment attorney named Elias Thorne, a senior litigator for the Federal Civil Rights Alliance, firing off a terrified, sleep-deprived email containing the picture of my roof and the terrifying per shingle mathematics of my impending ruin. When my phone rang the next morning with a Washington, D.C. area code, Elias Thorne's voice crackled through the speaker with the sharp, predatory energy of a shark smelling blood in the water, his laughter sharp and barking as he looked at the photograph, brutally confirming that while the roof was aesthetically atrocious, the HOA's desperate per-shingle calculation was the greatest legal misstep he had seen in a decade. He explained, with a chilling, joyful precision, that by citing me per individual shingle, they had engaged in arbitrary and capricious enforcement, fundamentally failing to identify which specific colors were illegal without banning the concept of the flag itself, arming me with a legal nuclear weapon just hours before the emergency neighborhood ratification hearing, instructing me to walk into the lion's den, place a charged Bluetooth speakerphone on the table, and let him execute the trap. The community center was packed to the fire code limits, the air thick with tension and the smell of stale coffee, as Margaret sat on the raised dais, gripping her wooden gavel with a look of supreme, arrogant triumph, projecting a slide of my glowing roof onto the wall as she publicly shamed my defiance, demanding my final statement before the board officially voted to cast me into financial ruin. Instead of begging, I walked steadily to the front, placed the black speakerphone delicately in front of her, and connected the call, allowing the booming, terrifyingly calm voice of Elias Thorne to echo through the silent room, systematically and brutally dismantling Margaret's authority, legally terrifying the surrounding board members by explaining that malicious, content-based discrimination voided their corporate indemnity insurance, meaning that the impending, highly publicized federal civil rights lawsuit would target their personal savings, their retirement funds, and their own homes. The threat of personal, inescapable financial destruction broke the board instantly. Arthur, the pale, trembling treasurer, immediately led a panicked mutiny, loudly overriding Margaret's hysterical screams of protest, moving to permanently dismiss every single fine and retract the lien threat just to save his own skin, leaving Margaret completely abandoned, staring out at a room full of neighbors who offered her absolutely nothing but cold, silent relief that her reign of terror had finally collapsed. She dropped her gavel, the hollow thud echoing like a final heartbeat, spitting a venomous curse at the room before fleeing out the side door, resigning her post, and eventually selling her house to escape the daily, blinding reminder of her defeat, leaving our neighborhood to finally breathe, the roof standing as a permanent, glowing beacon of defiance that local pilots used for navigation. It ended as a victory, a monumental triumph of individual rights over the suffocating creep of localized bureaucracy. But when I sit on my porch now, bathed in the red and blue glow of the setting sun reflecting off the asphalt, I sometimes wonder about the cost of the war. Is there truly a clear, moral boundary between a community's desperate need to maintain order and harmony to protect their shared investments, and an individual's fundamental, unalienable right to express themselves? Or does the absolute enforcement of either extreme inevitably turn us all into the very tyrants we swore we were fighting against?
Alright, and that is for today's videos. I hope you enjoyed it and found something useful. If you did, don't forget to like, subscribe and share it with your friends. Let me know your thoughts in the comment below. And thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.